Hi, I'm Max Talberg and I'm the founder and chairperson of the Global Visions Association. While working on a book project related to the association, I also started to develop my philosophical ideas of the foundations of reality, and this led me to create the theory of Coherent Emergentism, a comprehensive new theory of reality. This video delves deeper into the foundations of the theory. Other videos present the key ideas of it, as well as its applications as a philosophy of life. When attempting to understand reality, the first question is, why is there something rather than nothing? What are the possible ways to approach and answer this question? The first idea that comes to mind is this: reality, the fact that something exists because it is necessary, since no alternative can be conceived to exist. A second possible answer is that reality has an external cause for its existence. If we accept this, the next question arises: what is this cause? Must it necessarily be conscious of itself, of the nature of reality, or of how it functions? I suggest that something along these lines should be considered if one chooses this approach. Religions can be seen as taking this path. God or divinity is the reason why something, our world, our universe, and our reality exists. If this approach is chosen, the next question is, how does this agent influence our reality? Is it merely the initiator of reality, or does it also actively influence its cause or ultimate purpose? The more we lean toward the latter, the more significance we assign to this power and the less to other possible explanations. Personally, I would not be willing to choose this latter option. I believe reality should be explained as simply as possible, which above all means minimizing the number of external explanations, in line with Occam's razor. My own view then is that reality exists because there is no alternative. It is therefore also the cause of its own existence. However, this inevitably leads to a circular argument, where reality is the foundation of itself. Yet, I see no better alternative that can be equally well justified. We may also consider whether, in trying to understand reality, we inevitably arrive at a tautology, and whether this results from our own perspective, from the fact that we inevitably see reality in some way through the lens of our own experience. My thought is that some forms of tautology is unavoidable, because if we wish to understand reality with as few assumptions as possible, we cannot presume the existence of some external entity or force that causes reality to exist. Even then, we would have to ask why this entity exists, who or what created it, and for what reason. Therefore, if we assume as few external elements or explanations as possible, we must say that reality exists because it is necessary, that it is the cause of its own existence, that it has no meta-level or external designer, and that the modes of being are internally built into it. This way, no external cause or designer is assumed, nor any plan or meta-level guiding the development of reality. When we next approach the fundamental nature of reality, the question arises: what can exist and what cannot, and what is the relation between all these, both to themselves and to each other? At the outset, we might consider that the relationship between the possible and the impossible is ultimately what reality consists of, arises from, and evolves through. My own view on this is that on some fundamental level of reality, everything must be possible. I believe all possible alternatives must, in some way, be open and realizable if we are to think that reality forms in a comprehensive way, that is, in a way that can be exhaustively explained. If not everything is initially possible, we can always ask what could have been had this missing possibility been realized. Consequently, we would not be able to fully explain the comprehensive nature of reality or its causes and meanings. Moreover, if we can imagine that several alternatives are possible, we can also understand our reality more comprehensively, particularly in relation to other possible realities. What does current science say about the idea that, at the most fundamental level, all possible alternatives must be open, at least at the level of potential? This idea is known in quantum physics among some researchers as superposition, a state in which all possible states exist in a certain sense before an observation or other mechanism selects the realized alternative. According to this particular interpretation, which I choose to follow here, my requirement for the existence of all possibilities is thus fulfilled. From the perspective of my theory, these interpretations suggest that reality does not follow a single linear deterministic path, but explores multiple possibilities, many of which contribute to the development of emergent complexity, a kind of functioning that is not straightforwardly reducible to the behavior of its constituent parts. If we continue with this idea that all possibilities must be initially open, this could also provide an answer to why anything exists at all. In my view, something exists precisely because it is necessary, and if something must exist, it can only exist in a way that is non-contradictory and coherent in relation to its environment, but above all to itself. Even if this necessity arose by chance, we could still ask whether it continued to develop because the manner and development by which it occurred was selected among many events as the only one capable of sustaining and evolving itself. According to Coherent Emergentism, and this is the core idea of my theory, only those possibilities that promote a coherent, non-contradictory and self-sustaining reality persist, starting from the quantum level and continuing into larger wholes. If this were not the case, nothing could be built upon them, nor could they expand in practice. The origin of reality itself could also be understood on this principle. The energy required by reality can and has taken the form of matter only in a coherent way. All possibilities, including the realization of nothing, are among the set of all potentialities, but clearly this possibility alone is not realized, as even our own experience confirms. We know for certain that something exists. Thus, the state of nothing can be considered merely one alternative among others, but it does not materialize alone, because there are other alternatives that can be realized. Modern quantum field theory and cosmology support this. Even in a vacuum, quantum fluctuations occur, which I interpret to mean that nothing cannot exist in totality, and even the vacuum leaves open all potential alternatives. Therefore, something exists, as does nothing, but the latter does not actualize due to its own impossibility. Existence is necessary because nothing is not a stable option that could alone be realized. However, the alternative of non-being is still part of the set of possible manifestations of reality, and in that sense, the set is all-encompassing. I also believe that reality and the universe do not, in a sense, know theories. To ontologically demand a theory would require positing some meta-level of reality, and from there, it is not a long step to requiring a creator or guardian of reality. My own view is instead that reality simply exists because it cannot do otherwise, and that no external cause or agent subsequently determines how it functions or evolves. Instead, things just happen, though according to patterns of behavior that nonetheless arise from necessity. My related view is that, in an ontological sense, truth about reality cannot be known, because reality itself takes no stance on it, and the question is meaningless and irrelevant from its perspective. Reality presumably operates based on certain patterns, and I will examine those next. The most fundamental of these, in any case, is coherence. I believe that to understand reality, we must first examine its fundamental mechanisms of operation and level of being, and once we understand these, we can turn our gaze level by level toward higher wholes. This way of thinking can also be seen as a consequence of the idea that everything must in some way be connected to everything else. Even then, it is logical to begin by considering the smallest and most fundamental level and move from there to larger wholes. The opposite approach does not make sense. This approach does not necessarily mean that we could ultimately understand the functioning of the largest systems by reducing them to the operating principles of the smallest components of reality. In my view, reality cannot coherently and consistently exist, even indirectly, and its parts cannot be part of the same whole if its nature cannot be examined on a fundamental level. This level could be said to consist of the most basic being and behavior of its smallest parts, both from the perspective of operational principles and of time. Initially, there has only been the fundamental functioning of the smallest components, from which everything else has developed. What then is the relationship between this most fundamental form of being or its principles and the forms of activity we observe? Is it necessary that rules are involved in activity, and if so, what can we know about them? My view, once again, is that we should assume as few external explanations as possible. For this reason, my idea is that the rules of operation must be embedded in the deepest principle of being. If rules are seen as part of the nature of being, this means that the fundamental nature of reality inherently includes order and laws or operational modes that govern the behavior of entities and phenomena. In relation to non-contradictory existence, it can be considered that the associated rules are, or at least ought to be, non-contradictory with one another, at least for the most part. I think this is necessary because only such a reality can develop to the greatest extent. Just as with coherent being, coherent rules could, in my view, be filtered out from the most fundamental level of reality. Non-contradictory forms of being and their associated mechanisms or rules form a more coherent real totality, and this is the reason why they dominate in reality. When we continue to reflect on reality at the most fundamental level, the question arises, could the most fundamental principle of being be the very distinction between being and non-being? That is, the same reason underlying the existence of all reality. And could everything else arise from it in turn? This is also one of the deepest questions of metaphysics. Is the distinction between being and non-being the most fundamental starting point of all things? Could the entire reality and its laws, including coherence, emergence, and the laws of nature, arise solely from this difference, which in my theory is described as coherence? From a metaphysical perspective, the question of whether the distinction between being and non-being is the foundation of everything can be divided into a few viewpoints. First of all, is nothing a possible state? Philosophers such as Parmenides and Heidegger have pondered whether complete nothingness is even logically possible. Parmenides argued that as a state, nothing cannot exist because even thinking about it makes it some kind of entity. That is, a being. If nothing cannot exist, it means that being must be the fundamental state, and that existence is a necessary consequence of there being no alternative. This too supports the idea that the distinction between being and non-being is the fundamental starting point for everything else. From a physical perspective, it is believed that natural sciences have observed phenomena indicating that the difference between being and non-being is, in some sense, a foundational premise for all reality. This applies to both the origin of the universe and to quantum physics in the following way. According to modern physics, the universe may have arisen from a quantum level fluctuation, that is, a state where there was nothing, was not entirely empty, but contained quantum uncertainties. Quantum field theory shows that perfect emptiness cannot be a completely stable state. In quantum fields, particles and antiparticles spontaneously emerge and vanish in moments. This means that the difference between being and non-being is an active and continuously functioning process at the quantum level. This may suggest that existence itself is the result of the impossibility of nothing remaining perfectly nothing. The distinction between being and non-being thus generates reality. As for the emergence of natural laws, it can be suggested that if only coherent and non-contradictory rules can persist and replicate, this may be a direct consequence of the necessity of reality's existence. This means that all laws that allow stability and development arise from the fact that the difference between being and non-being produces order. This implies that the laws of nature are not random but result from the dialectic between being and non-being. From a philosophical perspective, in response to the question of whether this principle of non-contradictory existence is a natural principle of reality, the following can be stated. If something is not coherent, it cannot persist in existence over the long term. If something cannot replicate or reproduce, it disappears over time. Therefore, the laws and structures we observe in nature are precisely those that are both coherent and capable of replication. Emergence is thus not random, but the result of this selection process. In physics, there are also known phenomena where certain laws and patterns seem to select themselves because they are stable and replicable. If coherent rules enable a replicating and self-sustaining system, they can naturally be selected without external guidance. According to my theory, then, the fundamental principle of reality is the necessity of being. Something exists because it is necessary, and because what exists can only exist in a coherent way. This coherence is built into being as a necessity, not as an external cause or requirement. The mode of operation is therefore embedded in the existence of reality's smallest units. This too is irreducible to anything simpler. It can thus be generally stated regarding this theory that reality is not a static set of rules, but a dynamic network that selects itself from among the non-contradictory possibilities. It does not require an external cause or meta level. It simply functions in the only way it can, without destroying itself or ceasing to exist. From the idea that all possible events must be possible on some level, it follows that since this characteristic persists later on within larger and more developed wholes, they too can evolve in different ways, and partly even in contradictory ways. The richness and diversity of reality would thus gain a natural explanation. In this regard, coherent emergentism must also recognize that not all structure is perfectly consistent. Partial inconsistency, in fact, means local inconsistencies that do not disrupt the overall structure, but rather increase the possibilities for emergent complexity. The final conclusion related to what I have just presented is thus the following. Emergent rules are not random, they follow from the system's coherence. They may appear contradictory at different levels, but the whole retains unity. This enables complexity without violating the unity of nature. This could, in turn, lead to the idea that the functioning of the whole is not entirely reducible to the functioning of its parts, which is the core idea of emergence. Emergence can be more broadly understood as consisting of a new form of coherence that occurs when complexity increases and, through it, the entanglement of units intensifies. Emergence is thus a new form of coherence that manifests at the system level when units interact more frequently and in more complex ways. Furthermore, emergence can be described as the phenomenon where the same action of a single unit can have different effects at different levels of coherence, and above all at different times. A unit thus has multiple effects that vary over time. A single connection creates a new context in which these effects take on new meaning. Through consistent, non-contradictory events at the quantum level, reality could develop increasingly complex structures in relation to its individual components, without the need for external guidance, all the way up to life and consciousness. Consciousness is in fact the most advanced known form of coherence, arising through feedback and thereby capable of reflecting on its own totality. Consciousness is thus the reflective form of coherence. It also enables coherence to function in a complex and changing environment, which may be the reason for its evolution. Consciousness arises biologically in the human brain when a certain precondition of coherence is fulfilled, but it is, from that point on, inevitable. It's not something added or magically appearing. Consciousness can also be understood as gradual, as a temporal fluctuation and alternation between the functioning of the unit and the whole. This would resolve the contradiction between the actions of the unit and the whole, since a unit's action could influence the whole differently at different times. The same action would therefore not have different effects at the same time, an issue that has been a challenge for understanding emergence. Reality, more broadly, could be understood as a rhythmic oscillation between coherence and emergence. The key to understanding emergence is thus temporal separation between different levels of coherence, not simultaneous overlap. And the fact that the effect of a unit's action changes depending on the situation and the coherence level. This is why emergence is also not reducible to the single functioning of its smallest parts. Since reality can express all possible forms of being, they are also actualized within it and generate emergence. Since all individual initial events that can happen will happen given enough time, new levels of coherence and emergence will always form when there is sufficient time for their development. Coherent structures, in turn, actualize automatically because they endure. Coherence enables emergence and gives rise to a new, higher level of coherence. In reality, more broadly, that which is most coherent in relation to the external world develops the furthest and gains the most ground, or, in other words, finds a place in reality where it can evolve, because its relationship to the external is the most advantageous and fitting, allowing it to develop the most. This idea parallels what we know from economics, especially market economics, but also from biology and evolutionary theory. This is the core of my theory of coherent emergentism. Proving it to be valid would likely require demonstrating phenomena that cannot be reduced to the functioning of their individual parts, but which emerge at the level of the whole in novel ways. One possible way to prove this would be to show that two nearly identical systems operating in identical environments can, over time, evolve differently, because they develop different emergent mechanisms. This would mean that despite the similarity of their individual components, the development of the wholes is not entirely predictable or reducible, and that higher levels influence the functioning of the parts in different ways. Demonstrating such a phenomenon would clearly strengthen the evidential power of the theory. Similarly, if one could observe in nature or derive mathematically one or more principles or models of coherence, this could also serve to validate the theory. The next step, therefore, would be precisely the development of such mathematical models or scientific experiments. At a time when science is becoming increasingly fragmented, specialized, and experiencing a crisis of meaning, coherent emergentism could offer a credible new alternative, not merely a metaphysical theory, but a new paradigm for thought that transcends disciplinary boundaries. The theory is based on the principle that only coherent, self-sustaining structures can persist, and derives everything else from this principle. It provides a philosophical framework that can steer science toward unity, depth, and emergent meaningfulness. Coherent emergentism could thus be seen as a new grammar of reality, a paradigm through which we might understand everything from quantum physics to social collapse, from subjective suffering to ecosystem structures. It does not replace existing sciences, but rather integrates and deepens them. When coherence is seen as the condition for persistence and emergence as its natural form, my theory offers a framework that can significantly shape the future of thought and science. If reality is that which coherently endures, then science must be the systematic study of the emergence of coherence. This is the natural consequence of the theory. If reality does not care how it functions, and it has no meta level, then it may be reasonable to conclude that my theory is the only rational option. My theory is the only way to think of reality as containing the reason for itself. If reality is the cause of itself and has no kind of meta level, what remains is the conclusion that coherence is the reason for its existence, and the principle that determines all development. My theory may thus be the only viable option if we accept the radical minimization of assumptions. The problem with any meta level is the infinite chain of explanation. We are always forced to explain the reason for the next level, for as long as those levels operate outside the system. My theory moves on the boundary between philosophy and physics. It contains too much philosophy for physicists and too much physics for philosophers. Yet, it is precisely at this intersection that the theory draws its strength. It does not merely seek to unite previous metaphysical and physical theories, it also seeks to falsify them. It would show that the so-called theory of everything, as traditionally understood, cannot exist because humanity can always create, for example, new virtual realities to explore. New things constantly arise in the world and in reality, new phenomena, new levels, new emergent structures. Humanistic and social theorizing never ends either, because it continually changes over time, culture and self-understanding. Even if you could say that reality does not care what humans think about it, perhaps truth still does. Perhaps truth is, in some way, related to how we experience the world, how we construct meaning, and how wholes influence parts. Emergence is thus not only a physical phenomenon, but also an experiential and conceptual one. We can reasonably assume that emergence is a real part of the world, especially in relation to consciousness and the brain. It is easy to imagine that these are precisely the phenomena in which the non-reducible nature of cooperation becomes most evident. That is why we should hold on to our experiences of consciousness and emergence. They indicate that there is freedom, top-down causality, and thus a new kind of causal structure. In conclusion, emergence is not just a phenomenon, it is also a possibility. The possibility that the world can always change for the better in ways we do not yet understand. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to know more about the theory, you can do so by visiting theoryofreality.net. The website includes a book that is free to download. Please follow us also on social media.